So it's 2 minutes past two. I'm Ashok Handa. I'm the director of the Collaborating Centre for Values-Based Practice, and a very warm welcome to our panelists and also our registrants. So, as you know, this is a webinar on racism as a public mental health concern, and of course, racism has been much in the news, particularly since Sunday. And Colin, one of our speakers, is also an ex-professional footballer, so I'm sure he will have a view on that too. But of course, it's not an issue just for footballers, but it's an issue for others too, from race backgrounds. And the great thing about the Whiteness and Race Equality Network is that it's taking a joint approach to this, rather than people sitting at one end or looking at the other end, trying to see it from both sides. So I have great pleasure in opening this webinar on this very important issue, and also as a further evidence of the really important work that the REN network is undertaking with support from the Collaborating Centre. And of course, really delighted that Niall Boyce, who's the editor of Lancet Psychiatry, is taking part in another one of our webinars, and will be chairing the Q&A session later on. So I want to welcome you all and hand you over to Niall, who's chairing the first session.
Thank you very much, Ashok. It's absolutely fantastic to be here and anticipating some very interesting and stimulating presentations on what is, of course, one of the most important issues in mental health. Now, as Ashok, you said, this is an issue. The issue of racism is something which has been brought to our attention very acutely in the past year, and especially in the past few weeks. But there is, of course, a much broader, longer history here, a lifelong history, a chronic condition, if you like. And it's very, very important that I think we acknowledge the complexity and the depth of that history. And that's why I'm really pleased to see the topics of the first two presentations today. So first of all, we're going to hear from Colin King and Sade King on the escalator of social and race discrimination in mental health. Colin, would you like to start?
Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you very much. I'm actually overwhelmed that we've got an exciting list of people to speak on this issue. I'm very passionate, and I'm also motivated and sometimes tearful about the state of racism in modern Britain. I'm just looking for my PowerPoint presentation to look what I'm trying to discuss and outline in the next 15 minutes. So my name is Colin King, and they actually label me one of the worst pathological and demonizing terms. I'm a service user with a lived experience, and my lived experience is something called a diagnosis called schizophrenia I've had from 17 years of age. But if you look at these pictures, I think what they begin to do is indicate a real major concern for British society about how we define racism as a public mental health concern. And I'm going to use the word atrocity. It's not a concern for me, it's a form of atrocity violation. And also, I think there's a call for a reparation for the number of people that have died since 1656, when Cartwright made a diagnosis of depomania, to something that still persists in our national consciousness and framework, the notion of schizophrenia. And if you look at these voices, these pictures, we can begin to actually outline the impact of institutional racism in British society, from the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, when we got the definition of something called unwitting, like it's unconscious. But there have been victims in this period of time. And the victims are pictured here, from Sean Riggs to the mammoth loss and murder of Dalian Ackerson, who's a police officer. And just listen to this, visualize this. A person walking home is tasered for 53 seconds. He falls on the ground. He's kicked in the head with such a ferocity that his mouth opens, and he's kicked again, and he dies in custody. This is not one person. This is a catalogue, an escalation of number of people that have died in the system. From Barona Taylor, who actually died in police custody. So we have a major issue to begin to understand how we're using race as a definition. Now, Shada will go into much more detail about the clinical issues. I just want to the structural framework around race and how has it evolved as a definition from the 1965 Race Relations Act to the amendment in 2000. I want to give you a definition that's more relevant to the experiences of the interconnected identities of race that exist today. If we can just go to the next slide, that'd be really helpful. So most people, I've been in lockdown for a year, and it's the safest I've ever felt.
Colin, we just lost you and we're hearing a lot of crackling from the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I do apologize. So I'm Colin. My aim to discuss the experiences and identities. And we're looking at race to look at the interconnected frameworks and variables that affect who we are as a Black male from a working class Christian background, from an Afrocentric family who's been pathologized by structural racism within a range of political structures. And we want to find out how this permutates as a reality, as a pain through the family, through the school, and through what we call a notion of being misdiagnosed. Is that okay?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah, I do apologize for that. He messed the best bits now. I'm sorry about that. It's all downhill now. You can go to the next frame. That'd be really helpful. So I'm going to start off by saying that racism is a politicalization of silence as a public health atrocity. And whilst other people may more go into the clinical and diagnostic framework, I want to begin for us to actually frame what we actually mean by racism, using the definition by the Black Power movement during the period of the 60s and the civil rights issue, when they defined it as expressed in practices of social and political institutions. And we must position and place mental health as a pivotal role in this relationship in the social and the political. But also racism is also about individuals and informal groups that are governed by behavioral norms that support race thinking. And so when we look at mental health, this is a crucial issue around how white, particular Eurocentric behavioral norms infiltrate a Eurocentric and eugenic approach to race in mental health practices. But most importantly, what this definition allows us to do is address disparities and outcomes. And also, do we have a mental health system that's really a criminal justice system, a criminalization of Black experiences in the misdiagnostic framework? But we must see this as interconnected within other linking institutional settings, employment. I'm unemployed at the moment. Housing, the high percentages of people from particular background in poor, urban, inner city areas that resonated from the 1965 Housing Act, the implications of our hair care policies, and we know from recent research, particularly given to us by the government in terms of race and disparity report, the huge disparity issues between racialized communities that exist. But what actually makes that much more difficult is the lack of political power given to civil rights and Black community groups to challenge institutional racism within mental health care, and also as a public health concern. Let's go to the next one, please. So who am I? And this is the poem I wrote when my grandfather died in 2001. And I think it epitomizes the diversity of my experiences, but also how I am perceived in a racialized context in terms of structural discrimination. And in that context, it's informed by what I call structural discrimination. So I'm going to put a context to race and mental health. It's about this period of slavery and what it took away from an Afrocentric diagnostic framework that racializes and makes normative the experience of the cultural other. And all that, how that experience is actually denied within our current human rights legislation, our Equality Act, but mostly importantly, and sure they will go into great evidence in this, the criminalization of a diagnostic framework that is leading to the death, murder, violation of particular communities. And it's representing what I call a form of modern slavery in mental health practices. And I'm talking that from two oppositional positions. As a survivor who's been abused, restrained, controlled, overtly medicated and given a range of medication, and as a practitioner who's colluded and administrated with those particular practices. And so what that positions me is a diversity of an individual with two sons who also now have a mental health diagnosis or a misdiagnosis. So I'm going to introduce myself as Mr. Insane, schizophrenic and psychotic. Those are my detailed normative label about how they see me as a Black man in this world, as dangerous, difficult and threatening. But the other side of that positioning, in the reality of the African experiences, we are normalized through being a brother, son, father, uncle, and friend. But in the context of school, the first escalator of misdiagnosis, we're given, as I was, the notion of being educationally subnormal, delicate, and dyslexic. And that leads to an internalization where you actually distance yourself as somebody who wants not to be colluded within a white free zone. You have internalized dreams that are not articulated in the external world. You write that's seen as illegible and badly presented. You're perceived as mumbled, soft, but more importantly, in the context of British public concerns with race and identity disorder, you have become the #1 public concern. Your death, your violation becomes the capital of a white dominated society. And as I go to the next slide, if you just let me know how much I've got left. What is really crucial in this positioning which I'm presenting today, without going into detailed analysis of mental health diagnosis and trauma, which Sade will concern, is how Black men are perceived and what distinguishes them as a public health concern, and how that concern emerges through this really important relationship. And what happened in 1980s was a case of Christopher Columbus, where Black men were perceived as somebody who were dangerous and led to the murder of a white person. The emergence of something called the care program approach, the elevated use of Section 3 of the Mental Health Act, the overrepresentation in the care program approach. But also we must contextualize these public health concerns within a reality. The dysfunction of the Black family, the failure to position the implications of issues around gender, class, and sexuality, the notion that the educational imprisonment of the Black male experiences as somebody who's feared, and this notion of urban integration. As I move to, I think it's my last slide, I do presentations, and sometimes how people speak is really important. There are 3 people positioned in this: racism as a public health concern, the escalator of disempowerment. The first picture is a famous picture of a story about how we perceive and look at ourselves. And in that picture, we look at the public concern of what we call nigrophobia from the work of Fanon, how we choose whiteness as a superior image and the implications for our psyche. My son talks in this next picture, we haven't got time to listen to it, about how counseling interventions, psychological and psychiatric interventions are the new slave trade. He calls it probation, imprisonment, denial of the culture, who he is as a person. And then we go to Black women, which is really an underestimated, unresearched implications about how women are positioned. as a public health concern and a concern. But the last I want to point to this, just want to play this last one. I think it's about 1 minute. Could you play the thing?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I know you very well, but I'm still quite angry with what you said today. And I'll tell you why I'm angry, as somebody who's had schizophrenia for a long time, is that you're putting the plaster to something that's already taken place, rather than doing with some historical cause and political factors. And for me, unless you dismantle this political system that imprisons and criminalizes Black men, unless you change these underlying Eurocentric white models, which we're all guilty of, irrespective of our races, we'll continue to have the underrepresentation of certain groups in this story. I think, is there a time now for us to have a government inquiry about why are Black men illegally imprisoned in a mental health system, which for the last 40 years hasn't worked for them? There's not a sense of that the government should take this much more seriously, because we've had a history of equality training, awareness training. We've been through it all. And through that training, people have learned behaviors but haven't learned the right responses, or they are political advocates of the people they represent. I'm just advocating that the Black White Network and all the people here should be standing together with Unite the Space and actually saying we need to galvanize politically to challenge the system, because the system doesn't work. The story we heard this morning for 2 years is just one part of the story. Collectively, we have dismantled and eroded the Black community. So I'm saying to you now, love what you do, but this is a really fucking serious issue.
Totally agree with you. Couldn't agree more. And as I hope came over in what I said, which is that I've spent 30 years approaching things in the way NICE does, NHS England does, and it hasn't had the impact that I think we all would like. So, I think your point is well made.
But can we do this? Can we take it as a government inquiry about why are we so overrepresented? I don't want policies and procedures, inequality. I want a serious political investigation of why this is still happening in 2019.
I'm not in a position to be able to grant that or not.
Would you agree with that needs to happen?
I think that we need to do more than we are doing. A lot more, yeah. And I mean, you probably know as well as I do that I can't suddenly commit to this is what we should do next without that going through a lot of political hoops. But I do think it's not enough.
So I ended this story with my challenge to Professor Tim Kendall. We as a nation, as a country, as an individual, as a conclusion to this presentation, are not doing enough to ensure, to recognize and to respond to the central question here, that racism is a public health atrocity in mental health practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. That was absolutely fantastic and as ever, very, very thought-provoking. I mean, I think from the psychiatry point of view, this really confirms to me that psychiatry really and mental health needs to be more than a science and more than a clinical practice, but really needs to develop cultural and political awareness as well, if it's going to change and if it's going to be more effective and really provide a better service than it does at present. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to move on to Sade King, who is going to talk about trauma and its impact, and also on the political role of Black women in the field. Sade.
Thank you so much. Now I'm just going to share my slides. Okay. There we go. Yeah, so hello everyone. First of all, Colin, as always, is a real tough act to follow, so just giving myself a moment. But I think what I have to say will complement Colin's presentation really well. And what I'm about to speak to you about today is actually a project that Colin collaborated with me on. So yeah, it's quite special and meaningful. So I'm going to be talking about the psychological impacts of racism. Myself, I am a Black female trainee clinical psychologist, soon to be qualified. And I'm going to speak to you today about my doctoral thesis and some of the findings that have come out of that. And then I'm going to share some reflections at the end on my experience of being a Black woman in the system. So, first of all, just a note to terminology. So this is something that I deliberated about for a long time, in not even just in the early stages of my project, but right up until the end, in terms of how do we define race and how do we define those of us who are othered when it comes to our race and our ethnicity. And I know that there's a lot of controversy, particularly at the moment, around the term BAME, BME, terms which I myself do not subscribe to. But also we have people of colour, ethnic minority, all terms which I experience as quite derogatory, quite othering, and also quite, I think it's difficult when you think of people like myself. Actually, we're members of the global majority, so actually quite neglectful of that. So I settled on the term racialised for my project, and I think that speaks to people who are non-white having our race ascribed to something that is much bigger than our skin colour. So we have been racialised by power and by structures, and that in turn has denigrated us in society. So that's just a note to terminology. So my project is about racial trauma. So for my doctoral thesis, I explored psychologists' understanding of racial trauma and their experiences of addressing this with clients from Black and Asian racialised communities. And racial trauma is a term that, particularly in the past year, has kind of been floating around significantly more following the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent amplification of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a concept that hasn't really gained much traction in the UK as of yet, but there are a number of theorists in the US that have kind of coined this term and researched it a lot more prolifically than we have over here. So if we're thinking about what racial trauma is, it essentially is an emotional injury that is motivated by hate or fear of a person or group of people as a result of their race. And the key thing behind racial trauma is it is a motivated stressor that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. So what I'm talking about here are the psychological impacts of racism that make it a traumatic event for people. And this can be experienced in a number of different ways. So as well as racist life events, interpersonal events, we think about vicarious racist experiences. For example, and actually a very current example is what we as a Black community are currently feeling following the racist abuse of England football players following the final of the Euros on Sunday. That for me is an example of vicarious racism, and it's something that I'm currently feeling myself. Racism comes in the form of microaggressions, collective experiences of racism, and also transgenerational experiences of racism. If we're going right back to slavery, the impact of that is still seen today in the generations that have since come. So I won't pay too much attention to the next two slides, as they are statistics that can be researched, but I just wanted to give an understanding of why I'm interested, why this is important for me, and should be for everyone. So to pick out a few here, Black individuals are 5 times more likely to have force used against them by the police than white individuals. Racially motivated crimes accounted for 76% of hate crimes in the UK between 2018 and 2019. And at the time of the 2011 census, 3% of the UK population were Black, but Black individuals were more than twice as likely than white individuals to die in police custody, making up 8% of these deaths. So those are just a few, and this is by no means exhaustive, but this gives you an idea of where we're currently at in the UK. And within mental health services, Black individuals are 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than white individuals, more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, even when displaying similar symptoms to their white counterparts. And mental health services within the UK are largely based on Eurocentric paradigms and worldviews. So speaking there to Colin's earlier points as well. So this is just a little understanding of how racial trauma kind of comes about within the field of psychology. So at the moment, psychological trauma is most commonly understood in terms of diagnostic criteria for PTSD as actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. But we know that there are higher prevalence rates of PTSD in Black and Asian racialized communities. And this is consistent when accounting for other relevant factors as well, such as socioeconomic status. So there seems to be something there that that affects racialized communities when it comes to trauma that is different to white communities. And that's what I'm interested in. This model, there's a lot going on here, but the main thing that I would like to highlight is the bottom here, so reaction, signs and symptom cluster, and that is the impact of racism. So when we're thinking about flashbacks and nightmares, memory loss, inability to concentrate, hyperactive, depression, poor relationships, withdrawal, guilt, these are all symptoms when it comes to mental health diagnosis that are associated with trauma, but racism can and does evoke these same symptoms, but is not considered. So moving on to my study. So I recruited within North East London Foundation Trust. And I recruited 13 qualified clinical and counselling psychologists that were working across community and inpatient services. I had 11 female and 2 male participants. 8 of these identified as white, 3 as Asian, and 2 as Black. So I'm just going to briefly take you through my themes here. So I had 5 main themes in my study. So I interviewed the psychologists, as I said, about their understanding of racial trauma and their experiences of attending to this with service users, as they are termed in the mental health system, with from Black and Asian racialized communities. So my first theme was around navigating racial trauma as new territory. And this really speaks to the idea that really for psychologists, racial trauma is not something that they are trained and accustomed to addressing. So first sub-theme here, where is racial trauma in psychological assessment and formulation guidelines? So Darren here said, there is no diagnostic label that you can put on your RIO, homepage that gets you a certain treatment route for racial trauma. I mean, that's not really a term we use at work, I would say. So I think people probably would talk about it as trauma general, and then the context would be racial or otherwise on the basis of experiences that happen to feature. So I don't think it's ever talked about in the setting I work in anyway, as a particular type of trauma necessarily. And the second sub-theme here is the accumulation of racism leaves us feeling helpless and hopeless. And this seemed to speak to the idea that psychologists felt disempowered themselves to address racism, as they thought that it was something that they wouldn't be able to help their clients with. They saw it as something that was as a wider systemic issue. They wondered what contribution they themselves as individual clinicians would be able to make. So Mabel says here, I'm thinking specifically about a case we had recently of a young Black man who was sectioned by the police, which is absolutely not what the team had wanted to happen. And his mum was devastated that it had happened. And it just, when we were talking about it as a team, it just felt like there was this sense almost like of hopelessness, of like, what is going to change? How do we change this? And I wonder again if that sometimes just like almost puts the fire out of people wanting to think about these kinds of things. So my second theme here is about bearing witness. And this seemed to be the idea that for psychologists, even giving a space to racism within their clinical practice seemed to be a way that they were able to actually acknowledge that this was a real lived experience for the clients they were working with. So I had 4 sub-themes here. The first one around speaking up, and this that sub-theme kind of encapsulates the idea of speaking up within the multidisciplinary team that psychologists worked within. So Fiona says, I suppose I felt like it was such a serious thing to say and that very little people are racist, like, as in, you know, because you were going to be, I was going to be saying to somebody, just say you're the consultant, like, I get the sense that this is coming from a perception that you have about this young woman because of the color of her skin, like, so like that would be deemed me calling him racist, and I could get in trouble for that. The second sub-theme, when you know better, you try to do better. Paula said, this is something that you might not get right, so it's important that you know it's still good to try and not be too scared not to try anything, but that you might say something that's unhelpful to people as well. And I think I've had less awareness of that thinking because I was a nice person, everything will be okay. The next sub-theme is around validating the narrative. I won't read the full quote here, but just to identify here, Nancy actually speaks about a client who she believes has experienced racial trauma. So this was a Black man. He was arrested by the police in quite a violent way. And since then, he's developed quite a lot of PTSD symptoms. So for example, he can't go outside in the night now because if he sees the moon, it reminds him of like the torch in his eyes. And the numbers don't lie speaks to the idea that actually when psychologists grounded this within statistics that they were well aware of, it motivated them to understand that this was a real issue that they needed to be concerned with. So theme 3, the system perpetuates racial trauma. So this theme encapsulates the idea that actually the NHS, mental health services and psychologists themselves were not innocent and are not innocent in the perpetuation of racial trauma. So the first sub-theme here, an inherent sense of powerlessness. Isaac says, in terms of ethnicity and race, you know, these are our, and I'm air quoting, hard to reach kind of populations. And, you know, in the borough that I'm in terms of ethnic minority people, Black people are the majority group in terms of the minority group. So it just feels like we don't really have access to those people. So Isaac's kind of speaking to this idea of, we know that this is a problem, but we don't know how to change it. And the second sub-theme here is, we are not innocent as psychologists in the NHS. And Jennifer says, I think that psychologists notoriously sit on the fence. I'm very aware that I have done that in various ways. And I think we need to be more proactive. I think we need to be more vocal. I think we need to be calling a spade and calling out racism. The fourth sub-theme, I'll just skim through here in the interest of time. So theme 4 is same storm, different boats. And this was a very interesting theme as it really highlighted to me the differences between psychologists who were from white backgrounds and psychologists who were from racialized backgrounds. And this idea of actually there were very different experiences. And that's not to dichotomize these experiences, but the disparities were evident. So the first sub-theme here was, I'm a white psychologist navigating my privilege. And this speaks to the idea that for white psychologists, this felt like a new journey that they were going on, where they were relearning. Edith says, one of my clients who's Black British Caribbean, his partner is also Black British Caribbean. She has the same surname as me. I thought about that and I did discuss it with the client because I was concerned that she might think that my family were slave owners and that's how we've got the same name. And the second sub-theme here, I'm a psychologist from a racialized community and this is nothing new to me. And this is the idea that actually this work is exhausting for psychologists from racialized communities because it's a fight that we've been fighting our whole lives and is personal as well as professional for us. So when he says, that's the type of person I was active and doing community activism for a long time. And there have been years where I haven't been doing anything because you just get exhausted and you have to pass the baton on. And it's that extra emotional labor that I'm having to do and I'm willing to do, but depending on some days, my threshold is higher than others. And the last theme that I had is we need meaningful change, not performative change. So turning towards what next. And it was very important to me that this research is not just a thesis for my doctorate. I want this to be research that is taken into action and is used to influence change in the NHS. So I had 3 sub-themes here. The first one, 2020, the year of a racial awakening. Neelam says, why has this just come up now? Why are we talking about it now? What, just because of this incident in America? But this has been going on for generations. Why are we talking about it now? Why is it not something that we've addressed before? What, only now have you come to the realizations about how Black people are treated? But not just Black people, Black minority ethnic groups. I can really sense Neelam's anger here, and I really resonate with that. And it's the idea that, was there a racial awakening in 2020? And if so, where was the outrage before? Because this isn't an issue that's only been present for the past year. The second sub-theme here, the revolution will not be televised. This is a nod to Jill Scott-Heron's song of the same nature. This idea of actually the change comes from within and the change shouldn't be performative. And that means that when it comes to protests and when it comes to statements that are made, these need to be followed up with real action. And the last sub-theme here, the change needs to be collaborative. So that means that we can't just, as an NHS, as an institution, do this work. This needs to be linking in with local communities. This needs to be linking in with the people who are most affected by this. So those were my main findings from my research. I can actually feel how quite emotional I feel actually looking back. I haven't looked at my themes since handing in. So I think upon reflection, I think it's really, for me, it's been political to do this work, and it is political for me to be a Black woman in the field of clinical psychology. It's not been an easy journey, and it will continue not to be an easy journey. First and foremost, I'm a Black woman, and that has always been the stance that I've taken. But that has meant that I have been labelled the aggressor, and I have been labelled as somebody who is angry. And actually, I am angry. I'm angry about the situation, and I shouldn't have to tone police myself on that. However, I am committed to the cause. I know that this is the reason that I came into this profession, and I really hope that I can continue to do this work. Also, keeping in mind my own emotional well-being and my own experiences of racial trauma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sade. That was fantastic. And I think that's an example of how really good qualitative research can yield just fantastic insights. And it's not just the insights, that it strikes me that what you've got there are really practical potential targets for change as well. So I think that's just fantastic work. Thank you very much for sharing it. That's just brilliant. So what we're going to do now is move on to sessions 3 and 4. And so I'm going to hand over to David.
We're actually handing over to Anna. Sorry, Noel, we had a last minute change.
Oh, okay, in that case, I will hand over to Anna.
Thank you very much. So the next session will first of all focus on whiteness, and then we will move on to racism and work with refugees. So our first speaker is Simon Clark. Simon Clark is the co-lead for the Whiteness and Race Equality Network that is also hosting this seminar. So he's the co-lead together with Colin King, who we saw earlier. And I think, as Ashok mentioned at the very beginning, one of the key emphasis of the REN network is to have a co-production that works both ways. So as a bit of context here, and I say this as a very much of a white person interested in work on race equality, that type of work has traditionally focused on the lived experience of being Black in terms of mental health and also diagnosis. But one key mission for the REN network that Simon will be addressing today is the idea that for co-production to really work, it has to be two ways. In other words, we need to understand the lived experience of being white alongside and also in partnership with the lived experience of being Black. So on that note, I will hand over to Simon. I should also say that Simon is also a freelance writer, educationist and a musician. So over to you, Simon. I should also say that if you have questions, please put those in the chat and then we will address those as we go along. So do please put your questions in the chat. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to start my slides with a question from W.E.B. Du Bois. How does it feel to be a problem? This is a question that is on the first page of his book, The Souls of Black Folks, and it forces the reader to confront the plight of Black people in the US at the start of the 20th century, othered, excluded from society. But it's time to turn that question on whiteness. Here's George Yancey, Professor Yancey, with a quote from an article that he wrote. It's time to challenge the world of white normativity and white meaning making that creates the conditions under which Black people are already marked as different, deviant, and dangerous. It's time, in Yancey's words, to flip the script, to create a moment of uptake that awakens in whites a sudden and startling sense of having been seen. As an older white middle-class man, I know I have a lot of learning and a lot of unlearning to do. Well, how does white privilege shape my reality? Well, how long have you got? How much opening up of my world can I achieve? Am I prepared to put my white identity under the spotlight? But of course, it's easy for me to sit here pontificating. I'm conscious of the mental space, the room I have to operate in. I've never felt confined or restricted.
Simon?
Simon, we seem to have lost your voice.
It seems that his video is also paused. Anna, can we go on to Mo and we can try and get Simon back on?
Yes, absolutely. So while Simon is sorting out his technology, I am absolutely delighted to hand over to Mohammed or Mo Omar, who is the Policy and Development Officer for the Mental Health Foundation. As the name suggests, Mo's main focus is work with refugees.
I'm back.
Okay.
I'm very sorry, I don't know what happened there. I lost contact. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you fine. So I will go back then to Simon's talk, and then we'll come back to Mo's presentation in just over 15 minutes.
Okay, so as I was saying before, I so rudely interrupted myself, it's time to turn the question on whiteness, and it's easy for me to be pontificating. I'm conscious of the mental space, the room I have to operate in. I've never felt confined or restricted. That's what being white and middle class and male is about in our society. So how can I open this conversation? The only way to achieve communication is to be open, is to see it as two-way, is to share with others versions of reality and different narratives. If I am to claim to be taking part in processes that are about making meaningful change in society, I must ask and expect to be asked awkward questions. I must engage in dialogue where I hope to be able to use the first person plural, the we, where I am part of a process that is based on trust and openness as we explore what it means to move beyond what we call the colour line, beyond the social constructs that go around race. So a bit about my background. I worked for many years in education. I was a specialist support teacher in a further education college in inner London. I saw myself as having a role as a gatekeeper, slide 2, as enabling my students to have confidence and be ready to fly on their own wings. It's inspiring stuff, obviously, eh? But all this talk of enabling and pushing open doors is just talk, unless it is matched by coherent political action, as Sade was saying. So in the next slide, we have a quote from Professor Emejulu of Warwick University. She says that what's missing from the conversation is any political will to make the changes required. So I can rail as much as I like about the inequalities, recognize the societal constraints that restrict other lives, but what gives me the right, or gave me the right, to talk to students about finding their voice? Why should they listen to me? I have never in my middle-class white existence had to fight to maintain my place in this society. I've never felt what James Baldwin calls that rich confusion that comes from being aware of living in a divided society. I don't have to double think in my daily life. Slide 3 shows Du Bois and his quote about double thoughts, double duties, and double social classes, which lead to a hesitancy which is fatal to self-confidence. I've never experienced the restraints and slights that he talks about. Throughout my life, my white privilege has allowed me to pass through checkpoints and barriers with some ease. It's like I've been traveling on a freeway in my white saloon. Slide 4, my blankety blank freedom pass. I have a pass that means that at the toll booth, the barriers just flip up and let me go through. My journey has been largely trouble-free. I glide by, I go on my way. But now I recognize, or rather I've been made to acknowledge through my work with the Whiteness and Race Equality Network, that it's time to stop and get out of my white box and look around. Well, we're always being told, aren't we, that we're on some sort of journey. So tell you what, let's pull off this metaphorical motorway and I'll meet you at the next service station. Slide 5. Here we are, a nice, neutral, white ambience. So grab a chair and suppose that there's music in the background. Elvis Presley singing Hound Dog. It's good for sure, but not as good as Big Mama Thornton's original version. She knocks Elvis's take into a cocked hat. Now here's another slide. This is Bob Dylan. One of the inspirations behind Blowing in the Wind was the 19th century song of defiance, No More Auction Block for Me. I heard a recording made in the 50s by Odetta. This rich association between artists of different races needs to be explored further. Too often, the link that brings them together, that shows how one influences the other, is ignored. And in this process, Odetta's and Thornton's artistry becomes subjected to the restraints and slights that Du Bois talks about. The Black Lives Matter movement is helping us to refocus on the interplay between cultures, to reevaluate the contribution of artists and thinkers. Now, in any creative process, there needs to be an interplay And we don't need any sort of white checking process along the way. Progression routes for creative thinkers should be an open freeway, but that's not the case. Slide 6. Statistics show that people of colour might get on the bottom rung of ladders of such organisations, but it's hard to make progress. UK, this is from the UK Equality and Diversity Task Force data. Again, I come crashing back to Du Bois' analysis and realise its continuing relevance a century later. And I know what Sade says about the use of terms, people of colour and so on, how significant these can be in limiting our responses. Let me, if I may, stick to some observations about music. What I described above, the failure to fully acknowledge and value the contribution of Black creativity, sheds light on what happens in our society in general. Whiteness consumes, it consumes culture. If it likes the product, it takes it and treats it as its own. But it also likes the status quo. It doesn't like radical change, I would suggest. Change, questioning, shifting perspectives presents problems. If work is valued in its own right, it can become an act that affects change. Artists, thinkers, designers, athletes, footballers need to be agents of change. Their work can lead to re-evaluations, to the toppling of stereotypes and statues, and a re-evaluation of the significance of the lived experience of individuals and groups. If lives and cultural backgrounds can be respected and fully acknowledged, then we may be in a position to talk to and not at each other. Well, history is full of examples of missed opportunities. In slide 7, I show you some sheet music from the New World Symphony by Anton Dvorak. This European composer went to America in 1892. He was invited by white establishment to establish classical music in the New World. His hosts were disconcerted by his response to the Black folk music that he heard. As you see in this quote, he said that in it, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. His famous New World Symphony uses themes and melodies he derived from Black music. His views were considered curious by the white establishment, and they sidelined a lot of his commentaries and tried to ignore him. But in New York, he persisted, and in New York, he met a violinist and composer called, slide 8, Will Marion Cook, who not only became Dvorak's student, but was also the future mentor of Duke Ellington, who you see in this slide. And while this cross-fertilization of musical styles led to all kinds of innovations, white privilege meant opportunities for Black artists to actually make a living from their work were greatly restricted. Prejudice, white privilege shut the door. We can get a new perspective on reality only if we can enact the political changes that will validate expression of different cultures and celebrate the interaction between them. If we can open routes to dialogue and keep them open by clearing the landslides of ignorance and prejudice and privilege, we can start to work together. This is a political act. Enough of this constant asking Black culture, Black self-expression to justify itself and explain itself. We have to challenge the status quo, the patriarchal voice of white authority that too often dictates the terms of engagements. In our work promoting better mental health provision, there are many roadblocks we need to clear. Let's open up a route to those creative thinkers, those academics, past and present, who have worked to challenge the pre and misconceptions that the racialized thinking of the past has imposed. Slide 9. To quote Audre Lorde, in order to come together, we must recognize each other. We must, as she said, maintain dialogue. We need tools we can use to explore new ways of seeing what we thought we knew. Tools honed by commentators who enact changes that shift perspectives. So let's bring Du Bois, let's bring Fanon and Foucault and the rest to the teaching and learning table. Let's open a dialogue between Afro and Eurocentric approaches. It's high time. So finally, these new alignments must be reflected with the structure and organizations within the structure of organizations like REN and the Mental Health Foundation, if we are to enact change and not just talk. We have to seize the opportunity that my colleague, Dr. Colin King's work offers. Slide 10. His narrative and routes forward offers a route forward to a new consensus by highlighting the contribution of Afrocentric approaches and showing how they can complement European models. He shows how new perspectives can be opened, perspectives that will improve service provision. Here is an opportunity to enrich the teaching and learning and lived experience of professionals and service users alike. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll leave you with a list of the sources I use for this talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. Before we move on to our last speaker of today, I just want to remind our attendees to please post any questions or comments that you have into the chat, and then we will take them in turn in the closing panel session that we will end this day with. So please do put any questions or comments that you have in the chat as you go along. Okay, so with that in mind, it is my delight to introduce our last speaker of today, which is Mohammed Omar, who is the policy development the policy and development officer of the Mental Health Foundation's program for refugees. So Mo leads a capacity building project to raise both the visibility but also the voices of refugees in health forums at the national level. He's nowadays based in London, but his background is also very much in Scotland. So I believe he's still a board member of the Scottish Refugee Council, that also speaks to his background in law and in international relations. And today, Mo will address his work in this really important area. So welcome.
Thanks, Anna. And just going to share my presentation, and I hope you can see that and you can hear me okay. And thanks for the introduction, and thanks to my fellow panelists for setting up the scene for my presentation. Today I'll be talking about refugees and asylum seekers as labeled, but what I want to focus on are people and perceptions we have about these people and the power and the privileges, and under the framework of the theme that we're discussing today, which is racism, which as a concern in public mental health. I'm Mohammed, and I currently moved to London and developing a refugee program. And in the past, I worked directly with asylum seeker refugees. So in this presentation, and I'll be sharing some of my reflections and experience working with these groups, but also my own thoughts on this. Does not necessarily mean that this reflects the thoughts of the organization I'm representing. And please, if I'm talking too fast or there's something you don't understand what I'm saying, please use the chat functions to highlight some of the points, and I'll be more than happy to clarify them. And so I'll be talking about three key things, but the people themselves and the perception that we have about these people and the power dynamic that exists in around asylum seeking and refugee communities in the UK. First and foremost, I want to share 5 key facts that are very important and basic facts that sometimes we may overlook. The refugees are people, and people that have been uprooted from their homes and communities, and they had no choice to go wherever they want. You know, the people escape from war zones, from persecutions, and what they're looking for is safety. I really like a quote that Shira used: "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark," which illustrates the danger that people are running away, and no one would leave their comfort or around their family and the place they know, really. And the second point is that the majority of these people are victims of persecution, including racist abuses, and they've been exposed to, they may have been exposed to traumatic experience and events themselves. So those are people that are escaping from a very dangerous place, seeking safety and an opportunity to rebuild. And like all of us, all they want, it's a place to stay, a role to play, and a community to belong to. Basic needs that everyone should have access to. And the fourth point, and sometimes we overlook this point, is that when we talk about asylum seeker refugees, they're not a homogeneous group. By that, I mean that people from these communities are from different nationalities, they come from different ethnic groups, religion, languages, you know, like some very diverse groups. And personally, I think they're a gift to this to wherever they land, so that they can enrich us culturally, financially, socially, and all in all its forms. But sometimes the way we think about asylum seeker refugees, we group them together, and it's easier to otherize them, which I'll be speaking about in my next slide. The other important aspect about these people is that it's key to understand their journeys and their lived experience told by them without us making assumptions and making up story, their own stories, owning their story. So an understanding of the three key stages of migration, and before they left, and where they come from, the journey that they're going through in their migration, and in their post-migration journey. And that gives us an insight about some of the challenges and the factors around their mental health. And it's important that comes from their voices and their experience, rather than for us making those narratives for them. In the UK, and apologies if I'm stating the obvious here, we use these two terms in the refugee sector: asylum seekers and refugees. And it's important to distinguish that. And the reason I'm using it now is because they have different entitlements and different rights in the UK. In an asylum seeker is someone who has made a claim to the Home Office for asylum, but is not yet recognized as a refugee under the 1951 Refugee Convention, and it's a human right to seek asylum in another country, specifically in the UK, because the UK it's a signatory of the 1951. So there's a legal obligation that sometimes we don't talk about in the media, but we rather politicize this group. And a refugee is someone who was an asylum seeker, and that their application has been successful, and usually they gain their leave to remain, and which enables them to stay 5 years in the country. And if the situation in their own country has not changed, then they can apply to stay permanently in the UK. And generally, a refugee have the same rights as someone as a UK citizen. So understanding people, it's very important rather than labeling them and making up stories for them. In specific in relation to the theme that we're covering today around racializing and othering groups, I think it's very important to cover perception. And when we cover perception, language matters, because what we read, what we consume intellectually, or and our life experiences, inform our perceptions, and it's very important that we combat that, and we seek to address, to find facts around the people and what they are. For example, my first point I make around the language that we use. If, for example, now if you put on Google bogus, fraudulent, threat, illegal, you'll probably get some results related to asylum seekers and refugees in the country. And we're talking about people, and as I said in my slides, these are people that have been going through a lot, and we must ask ourselves, why are we getting these results? So is there something beyond our understanding of people, and also the fact that historically the UK, in fact, some of the drafters of the UK Convention were British lawyers, and where we are now with the politics around this topic, it's horrible. And if you can see the poster here, Breaking Point, and I'm sure like some of you may have across during the Brexit campaign, it's very much inaccurate, and also scary, for someone who's as an asylum seeker, and the fact that there's very little challenge around that, and as I always say, the one with the bigger microphone has a louder voice. That's where we are, and that's a concern. That's a concern, and we start thinking, like, how do we get from politicizing and making people others. And I wrote global events and impact on local lives as my next point, and two events that I think that we must consider when we look into that. It's the 9/11 and the recent global recession, when this narrative around othering and racializing the conversation in public discourse is becoming normalized, and it's becoming more prevalent and more acceptable in public domain. Again, it's something that's untrue. Like, it's something that we must combat, and looking at the data, proliferation of social media helps that, and fake news and the post-truth world, and we are really in a very difficult situation now, where it's difficult to make a point around the compassion and the humanitarian language that we should be using to safeguard, to protect, and population. And now we're talking about bordering and securitization language on this team. So that's a political football. And again, working in the mental health narrative, again, and we're sometimes victim of our own perception, and defining people resilience or vulnerable, depending on what, without mainly having these people at the table and talking for themselves. So I thought that I would give you a bit of 5 key points that I thought were relevant in our conversation around racializing the language on this theme around perception and without seeking real knowledge. My next slide is around power, and the power dynamics that exist within individuals and institutions. And currently we have two pathways in the refugee sector. We have the asylum pathway and the refugee resettlement pathway. And as I said earlier, when someone comes into the country, they'll have to submit asylum claim, they'll have to go through a screening interview, substantive interview, which means that they'll have to retell their story of trauma and the story of not being believed, making a case for themselves, and then going all this through the system without with language barriers, new culture, maybe there's the a gendered approach where single woman would come in and has to go through all of that, and they've perhaps been going through gendered focused trauma, and that is something that needs to be considered. And on the other side, and sometimes the refugee resettlement is seen as the most that the way that the UK should go forward in the future. But then again, it's about picking and choosing which refugees should come into the country, and the criteria that is being used, and it's the danger that this can be abused and othering and go into that theme of the good and bad immigrant. So that it's I hope it gives you a bit of an insight around the power dynamic that exists around that. Again, the immigration and segregation is the scariest part about talking about the border bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, and linking up with immigration. It's becoming such a security issue rather than a human right approach that we should cover this topic. And when we talk about security issue, then where does the mental health needs of this community would come in the agenda? So it's quite scary. The resettlement and integration of refugee, again, sometimes these are positive, but sometimes we define what resettlement means and integration means to people, and I think we should do a bit more by including and listening to the voices of the communities that are being resettled in our communities, and making sure that community cohesion and integration being a two-way part, where, as I said, these are like people that bring lots of gift to us in terms of cultures of how are we not benefiting from them, but we're seen as them as aliens almost. And my last very important point, it's about understanding for communities around hate crime. And the UK has some of the most, I would say, arguably one of the strongest hate crime legislation in the UK. However, for this group, given the different barriers, it may be very difficult to understand how it works and the reporting system. If there's no trust with the authorities, very, very difficult for someone to go forward to report a hate crime, understand whether they are a victim of the hate crime, and be more accepting of being victims of racism, for example. It's prevalent among this community, but also trying to make sure that hate crime is literally defined and the mechanism work for everyone. And I think it's very difficult. It goes back to the line around when you're an asylum seeker, going to the police may be difficult, because if you're thinking of reporting a hate crime, you may think like that may jeopardize your immigration status and all of that. So I think there's a lot of things to be doing better, and for us to be aware of our privileges and power, the dynamics that exist between individuals and organization. In conclusion, it's five key takeaways that I hope I can offer in this presentation. It's to understand and appreciate the people and communities that live among us, and their needs and how they can contribute in their new community, and proactively to challenge the myths and misinformation, which is sometimes go on social media and you read certain things, you're thinking like, how on earth this is things, and you can see people retweeting about it as well, which is horrible. And voice and visibility, and making sure that there's a seat at the table for people with lived experience in the refugee sector, and for us as researcher, policy and practitioners, making sure that we are aware of our privileges and we are aware of the assumptions that we make of community, and acknowledging and embracing refugee lived experience in the mental health sector would go a long way in trying to be truly person-centric approach. So these are like some of my reflection, and be more than happy to contribute with the answers later on. Thank you.
Anna, you're muted.
So very thank you, Mohammed Omar, for your fantastic talk. Yes, just as a comment, I don't want to abuse my privilege, but I think that question that you ended with as to who speaks and who listens, there is a very important responsibility that we white migrants can play in that. Now, I speak here as a Swedish, not an asylum seeker, but very much a migrant. I've never had any abuse or anything like that. I got the definite leave to remain, but that's partly because of this phase. So I think that's a very important responsibility that we share together. Okay, so we're now going to move to a general question and answers session. And David, do you want to hold that, or shall I just continue? What's best?
I'm ready to take over chairing, Anna, if you're happy to relinquish the reins.
Yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting listening to all these presentations. We have a few questions coming in on the chat. I would encourage people to either use the question and answer box or the chat facility, and I will pose the questions either to specific members of the panel or to panelists in general. So panelists, if you want to answer a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or I may call you if the question is obviously aimed at a particular panel member. I'd like to start by asking each of the speakers in turn. Anna and I are running a project that's really about public mental health and what the contribution that people involved in public mental health can make to a range of complicated issues. So if we were invited by Andy Burnham as Mayor of Manchester, which is where Anna and I are currently sitting, to advise him on a public mental health strategy for Manchester, and we wanted to put challenging racism and understanding whiteness at the heart of that public mental health policy, what would be, in a sentence from each of the speakers, what would be your advice? What would you want us to be telling him as someone who does have the power to lead Manchester, for example, or it could be Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, or anyone else in that kind of level of authority for their community? What would they be saying to make a difference? I'm going to come to Simon first because he's miraculously appeared on my screen in front of me. So Simon.
Well, I think my first piece of advice would be to go to community groups. As Sade said, we are used in our society to people being talked at rather than talking to people, and more importantly, listening to the views of people from communities. And we know, I know from my experience of being involved in conferences, that conferences come alive when people are talking to each other rather than being talked at. And it's essential that we listen to the community now and that they take the lead in advising us. Two-way communication.
Thank you, Simon. Sade, can I ask do you have any thoughts on that? If we were given an audience with a civic mayor, a civic leader, what we should be saying?
Oh gosh. Well, Simon stole my point, but I think I would add to that involving communities, but also being very mindful of vicarious trauma and the work. Who's doing the work, and what are you asking of these communities? Speaking as a Black woman myself, I'm very aware of the position that I assume as a professional, but also the work that I do behind the scenes to keep myself safe. So I think it's about involving communities, but also being mindful about what you're asking of these communities, because we know that racism isn't a problem for racialized communities, it's a problem for white communities. So yeah, I would just add that.
Lovely. We'll come back to you about the keeping safe, because there's a specific question on that I think is right up your street. I'm going to ask Colin now. Colin, I would love, if I was going into that meeting, you and Sade, we would love to have you by our side. But what would be your strong message for a civic leader who's responsible for public mental health to foreground racism and whiteness in their thinking?
Well, firstly, I would ask Boris Johnson and Priti Patel to make a public apology for the announcements as watermelons and pickaninnies that set a narrative that has pathologized the Black community. That's the first thing I would do. Secondly, I would ask them to dismantle, remove a neoliberal commercial approach to mental health that makes people commodities. So the system we have at the moment is a criminalization of mental health, because it's dictated by a cost-effective approach based upon a service level rather than needs-led approach to community needs. Unless we get back to the radical Bailey and Breaks model of the 1960s, which is about the politicization of communities, rather than a commercial contract-led approach, we're always going to have these underlying problems of looking at race rather than look at what are the major factors that underpin racism in public health.
Lovely, thank you, Colin. That's really helpful. And Mo, any thoughts from your perspective? And I know you'll have experience from a Scottish political landscape as well as a broader UK one.
I've got all the intersectional tick there, and absolutely. I mean, expertise by experience. That's what I would ask, but also, and what I would demand is to feel a bit more challenged, and in terms of looking at all the existing policies and where are the gaps, where are the gaps in terms of including meaningfully people that historically have not been represented in the conversation, and also the follow-ups. Sometimes it's very easy to go and do consultations, but then what are the follow-up? What does it mean involvement, defining those with communities? Because also let's remember that there are overly researched groups, the people that we're talking about, and we need to be careful about that, in terms of designing the approaches and engagements as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Mo. We have a very specific question. I'm gonna ask Sade first. I might also, but if other panelists want to comment on this question, please feel free. But the question is, sorry, my screen is slightly playing up. The question I have, Sade, is, sorry, swearing at my screen. The question I have, Sade, is how do we look after our own mental health and well-being, or find positive coping strategies while doing this sort of research as racialized academics within a system that is already hard to navigate as a person of color?
First of all, that's a great question, and one that resonates with me a million percent. And I would say actually that when I chose the topic for my thesis, that was a topic in supervision for me. My course were very concerned. I quote, they said, how did I intend to maintain analytical distance from the topic, which is quite frankly impossible. I would say in terms of taking care of yourself. It's hard, and I think that there is extra work that has to be done. So it's almost like you've got the research and then you've got this self-care. So it's almost like you're doing two projects in one. For me, it's been about therapy. I engage in my own therapy on a fortnightly basis, would not be without it. I've been able to explore what's come up for me, and for me it's important to have a Black therapist, so that's just a preference of mine. Supervision, so making sure that you have supervisors who understand your personal position and respect and value it as well. You know, these are people who you'll probably be publishing with and who will also have their name to your work, and so it's really important that you have people on your team that you think represent your work. And also, if you can, at the beginning, really planning out space for breaks. And I mean those unintentional breaks where sometimes it feels just too much and you need to take a step back. I definitely had some of those along the way in doing my thesis. So I really appreciated the opportunity to just take a second and say, I've had enough for a little while. I need to regroup with myself. So yeah, those would be my main points.
Thank you, Sade. Is there anyone else from the panel who wants to think about, you know, how they've looked after themselves, either with the research, or I'm thinking, I mean, Mo, the work you've done with the refugees, that must have an impact on your mental health when you see some of the things that you see. I mean, are there other people who have some thoughts about how people can look after their own mental health in these kind of roles?
Colin wants.
Colin, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Thank you. Perfect.
God, I think there was a parallel between diagnosis and academia. And I think you've got to decolonize and dismantle both structures so they represent the cultural heritage of the people inside the structure, rather than historically the values that have emerged over a period of time. Research from a lived experience is the most painful thing you can do, because you're researching a reality that's been misconstructed over a period of time. And if we're going to have lived experience models, they have to have parity with existing research models. Ontologically, in terms of regard as legitimate theory, epistemology, that are knowledge-based that challenges how research is captured and how people are actually looked after. Because if you do not do that, we're going to get labeled. Just like race is a diagnosis in mental health work, it becomes a diagnosis in lived experience research. And so there needs to be system changes that actually translate and transmit right down to that micro interaction in terms of well-being. And also a specific transcultural well-being model that reflects our heritage is quite important.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Colin.
If I can just add one thought to Colin's observation there, it's also very important, I find, that to enable that dialogue and to really think of this as a way of empowering yourself as a white academic. Because the othering can also go both ways. You know, as a white academic, you're perceived a certain way. You're perceived as somebody who will not have a diagnosis, and just to have that open-ended dialogue, it can actually be a way of finding your own voice and humanity. So I just want to again emphasize the importance of the dialogue here, and the responsibility precisely lies on you as a white person, but also with that comes opportunity for growth.
That's a really helpful reminder. Thank you, Anna. I've got a question here, which I mean, for me, I'm going to pose it to Colin first because it's so chimed with that lovely interaction I saw between you and Tim Kendall on your video. So, Colin, but others, please, if you want to answer, please do. But the question is, how do we put a break on this recycling conversation of racism in public health, NHS, social care, justice system, and so on, and get some proactive, meaningful change? I feel pain and trauma attending events where it is all about how little we have changed. What will make a major shift and transformation to action these? Again, that just seems to absolutely chime, Colin, with your your conversation with Tim Kendall. So any thoughts from Colin, but also really happy to take thoughts from other panelists on that as well. I can't hear Colin.
So I muted myself. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Perfect, Colin. Perfect.
Oh, this has been swearing for 5 minutes. That's okay.
I'm not surprised.
That's the best part of my presentation, and it's part of my stand-up. The question's a fantastic question, because I'm 61 and I'll be dead soon. So it's really good that Sade and Mohammed are carrying the baton of change from me, but also need to have a life of change where Sade and Mohammed and Simon are writing books that change conceptually how we think about race and mental health. And they become as important as white academics, as Fanon, as Young, as those people that we reference continually to underpin our experience. If we're still using divorce in 2021, we got a major problem, right? But those books need to actually look at politicizing psychiatry, counseling, the psychology, just like Sade said in their presentation, to enact political change. Also, that we need to galvanate at the grassroots together, working class and Black movements, to change the mental health system, to get rid of it. It does not work. It's a criminal justice system. And if we don't understand that, we're actually going to be criminalized for the next 200 years within this system. But we also need to be working together to challenge people like Professor Tim Kendall. Let me tell you something. These people ain't too smart, right? And we've got much more intellectual, academic people within our communities that can actually produce better systems and better outcomes. And we need to look at the Black Power movement of the 1960s, and what the civil rights were trying to do from sports was empower communities for political change. Unless we do that, we will continue to be talking about trauma, but we need to use trauma in a conceptual way to understand structural whiteness as well, or structural trauma within institutions. It's not going to be used just as a diagnosis, but it can be used as a definition. But in 2021, I'm really scared. I look at the white paper mental health. I look at all these reports. It's the continual demonization of the BME experience. But going back to Anna's point, and my last point is this: we've got to work across these lines of gender, of race, of class, if we're really going to change the system together.
Okay, that's really helpful, Colin. And I'm going to use that as a nudge to ask Simon for your kind of your take on this. You've talked about some of the changes you want to see happening from a white male perspective. Could you add a few thoughts to the question? I'm happy to repeat it if you need me to.
Well, I think it's essential, as Colin says, to go to listen to people. We talk about the grassroots, where conversations of great value are taking place in community centres, in colleges, and we have a responsibility, if we are gatekeepers of any kind, to be enabling those conversations to be heard in places of power. The power, as Colin says, the power and the knowledge is there. It needs to be heard more widely, and it needs to be valued. It's just not well. I think the footballers are doing a tremendous job by standing up and challenging the people in power now, and by calling out what they see as rank hypocrisy in the recent responses. And it's that kind of bravery that needs to be felt and passed down to people who currently feel powerless within our societal structures. I better get off my soapbox now and let someone else have a word on this.
Okay, I'm always happy to share your soapbox.
Go on then.
So no, it's really helpful contribution. But other panelists, this changing, those of us of a certain age, and there are a few of us on this call of a certain age, Yeah, we do get frustrated about feeling like we're saying the same thing day in, day out, year in, year out, decade in, decade out. I've lost count of how many mental health act reviews I've lived through where it's been a topic of concern that we disproportionately detain certain groups. We know that. We've known that since the 1983 Act was introduced, and I don't have enough fingers and toes left to count how long ago the 1983 Act was introduced, even if I use my earlobes. And it's just kind of, there is that frustration. And so we are looking to new generations. We're looking to Sade. We're looking to Mo to do something constructive and positive about that. But the stuff that we still want to do as well in our twilight years, can I put it that way? But I'd be really interested if other panelists have a view.
For me, David, is asking the right questions, and I don't think we are. We're talking about racism. Like I'm a big football fan, and one thing that shocked me the most in the past few weeks is the fact that players that want to take the knee, and there's like some huge objections about why they're taking the knee and where we are with that. I think like that shows where we are with the topic of racism and attitudes towards that. And the second point is about like the three black players that missed the penalty. So we have to highlight that, Rashford, he's feeding other children, he's doing good for the community. Therefore, we shouldn't abuse him as like if he was any other person, it doesn't deserve to be, like racially abused. We shouldn't put like a class thing of like, you need to be benevolent or do something good for the community to get your gift of racial-free things. So I don't think we're asking the right questions, and I don't think we are where we should be. And hopefully, we can put in an agenda, but start feeling a bit more uncomfortable so that we can grow together. That's my hope.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Mo. We've got one more question I've seen in the chat. Again, bear with me. It's sorry. Do you feel structural racism is worse in countries that are former colonies? Mo, as I've got you in front of me on the screen, do you want to have first thoughts on that? Structural racism worse in countries that are former colonies? You're on mute. Ah, perfect.
That's such a loaded question, and I don't know if I have the.
And again, if you think it's the wrong question and want to rephrase it, that's absolutely fine as well. It's there to provoke a discussion, I'm guessing.
I think I probably pick on like some of the points that Sade have raised, about vicarious trauma and people that are from former colonies coming into this country and yet struggling with immigration, with society, and all of that. And what does that mean in our society? I think that is something that would be interesting to look at, but I wouldn't have the real knowledge and the data in front of me to make like a very informed comment on this. But vicarious trauma is something that we need to take seriously, and when we talk about racism in this country.
I mean, I was struck, Mo, by a comment you made when we were discussing this seminar, and you talking about people experiencing racism at every stage of that refugee journey, long before they get to the UK, but that kind of constant, nasty, pernicious filter of racism for every step of the way, and that just frightened me. It made me kind of tense just when you were describing it, and I know I should know it, but it's still something that I think had an effect on me when you reminded me.
Yeah, and also our ability to learn from our past. We don't tend to learn from things. Migration's been there for like before anywhere else, but still we're making the same mistakes, and also there's a lot of things that are not right in the immigration sector. That I think racism and racializing and othering has been there and is still here in 2021. That's a concern.
Thank you. I'm now I've got no more questions coming up. So if it's last call for any questions, anyone who wants to pose any. But I'm going to give each panelist in the order we had the speaking one final closing thought from each panelist, and then we'll go to Ashok to bring the meeting to a close. So I'll start with Colin. You were our first presenter. So Colin, final thoughts that we can take away with us.
There's a really serious problematic issue about the discussion today in that, and it actually cross-references to the experiences of Black players taking the knee, and people do not really understand the history.
I'm losing you, Colin. I've lost the sound again.
Can you hear me?
That's better.
Yeah, so what I was trying to say is that people need to seriously analyze the political symbolism of taking a knee and how it's lost its implications from slavery, when we were positioned as being dehumanized and in the definite position to whiteness. My closing analysis from the work today is that stop looking at the implications of racism as measured through the experience of the Black experience, rather than look at, is there a mental disorder within the structural systems within white society that is creating what Littlewood and Lips would call a form of cultural schizophrenia that is colonially out of reality to the people that it's looking at. And so we look at the wrong problems. Rather than looking at Black people, why is it white people are underrepresented in this system tells you much more about the implications of racism as a public order. And we always research the wrong questions and the wrong outcomes. And it denies how we are actually going to solve this issue in terms of how these systems are racialized and need to be dismantled. I'm really concerned because ICD-11 is coming out quite soon, and DSM-5, which has led to the murder of our community. These systems need to be eroded. They should never be part of mental health practice. And to believe that mental health is a science, or psychology, I'm not knocking it, is a science, is a real concern to me. We need to look at the value behind the science that's leading to these outcomes. And this is what the whole work that Bill is trying to say. Value-based practice has a big implication as public disorder. But I also say it's a public violation of veracity rather than a concern.
Thank you, Colin. Sade, can I have some closing thoughts from you?
Yes, I think my first closing thought is how heavy I feel and how heavy I have felt over the past few days, actually. It's been a very difficult few days. And I think that speaking today has been difficult in many ways, but has also, I'm grateful to be in a space where these conversations are being had, but more importantly, there is a desire for change. And having only been a part of this collective for a short time, I can see that is a real motivator in terms of research, in terms of changing clinical practice. So I think I'm coming away with a heavy heart, but still a hopeful heart.
Thank you, Sade. Simon.
Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization. His reply was he thought it would be a good idea. We have to challenge ourselves at that level to really say, you know, what are we about in our society? And we have to, Mohammed mentioned about taking lessons from history. We have to look at our history and realize the damage that we have done through our colonial past. We don't need to shy away from it. yeah, we built a few railways here and there, but the reason we built railways and everything was so that we could exploit and take away anything that was on the ground or under the ground of the countries that we used. We need to face up to that. We need to accept that, and we need to see that as a hopeful thing, to be talking in these terms now, and to be, as we've all agreed, to open a dialogue so that we can start to listen to one another rather than tell people how they should behave. We should work from the ground up for a change and not impose ideas on people. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Simon. And Mo, final thoughts from your perspective?
I was on mute, sorry. And thank you so much for creating this space for this conversation, very important. I think it's a very, very important and very educational in many in many ways. I think it's important to have this on the agenda and now, but not have it on the agenda only when it's sexy, when it's great, you know, like when everyone's talking about it, but keep having an agenda and bringing in very different perspective and challenging perspective into the conversation. And I think that's what we need more and more, and more people with impacted communities involved in this conversation. It's crucial.
Brilliant, thank you, Mo, and welcome to the team. It's been brilliant to have you and Sade join those of us who've been working on this for a little while, and we don't plan to go away anytime soon. So I'm now going to hand over to Ashok, who I'm hoping is there to take us through to close. Ashok.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. For some reason,
I can hear you fine. I can't see you.
Yeah, Mihir is. Oh yeah, I think he disabled my video. Okay, here we go. So sorry, I got a bit of sunshine behind me. So, well, this webinar has brought together this diverse and rich panel of speakers, and it's hard, I have to say, to follow the closing statements from our four speakers. So, I mean, Colin has given us this really powerful message from his lived experience, not just of racism, but mental health, but from the perspective of an academic, a personal perspective, and actually a political perspective too. And you might think, well, why not stick to one? But of course, it is all around us, and so we need to look at it with all of those perspectives. Sade has picked up stuff from her doctoral work and the bit that I was particularly moved by was these everyday acts of microaggression and the vicarious racism that we've seen highlighted, particularly the last few days. Mohammed, we didn't plan this seminar based on that. It was planned a while ago. So as you say, it's not because it's topical, or it's just because it's important. And then Simon really giving us those concepts and perspectives of both recognizing and that self-awareness of white privilege, which people still found a concept that they refuse to accept even exists. And to have you do that is, again, really powerful, and let's hope more people can do that. And then Mohammed just reminding everyone that refugees are real people, not just something we see on the news, uprooted, persecuted, and your phrase, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark, really important way to think of it, and something I hope you'll allow me to use again when talking to others about that. So what I think we've had is much thought and evidence for the importance of the formation of the Whiteness and Race Equality Network, bringing together those perspectives, and certainly I've found inspirational today and a privilege for the Collaborating Centre to support and help you continue your important work. So it just remains for me to thank you, the speakers, Colin, Sade, Simon, and Mohammed, the chairs, Niall, Anna, David, Mihir in the background, getting all the IT and stepping in when we were failing with IT to keep us going. But really, what I'm grateful for is the support that REN has from the Mental Health Foundation, through David's offices, through Lancet Psychiatry with Niall Boyce, Manchester Metropolitan University with Anna, who's newly promoted to a readership there, and to Bill in founding the Collaborating Centre for Values-Based Practice at St Catherine's College in Oxford, and the support the college has continued to give us. And I hope that as we go forward, we will continue, in Mohammed's words, of challenging the myths and misinformation so that we can all personally be role models in speaking up and speaking out and calling it out when you see it, whenever you see it, any time of the day or night, any day of the week. So with that, I want to thank you, our participants, and I hope that you will encourage colleagues, friends, and associates to watch this webinar when we upload it onto the website in about 7 to 10 days. Thank you all. Bill, I don't know if you wanted a final word on that. You're muted, Bill.
Thank you, Ashok. Like you, my video camera was disabled at some stage, just like to add my thanks to everybody for an extraordinarily stimulating webinar. I'd like to add that one of the things that gives me a hopeful, if still heavy heart, is pairing your video clip, Colin, of your conversation with Tim Kendall with what you said at the end about looking seriously at the values that sit behind the science, if I could put that in scare quotes, the science that's driving our mental health system. And that, I guess, is where Ashok, the Collaborating Centre, might be able to bring something new to the table. The reason it's a heavy as well as hopeful heart is that Tim Kendall is one of the people in a position of power to make things happen. As you saw in that clip, he's very conscious of the limitations of his ability to make things happen. I've been for a long time a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. They've been enormously supportive of our work in philosophy and mental health generally. But when we've started to talk about values and science, suddenly it becomes very problematic. I suspect that if we are to make change happen, we somehow have to get that message across that science, certainly in an area like psychiatry and psychology, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a very definite values context. And what's come across from today's meeting is that that value context is, of course, partly individual values, but also and crucially social and political values. And this is where I feel the Whiteness and Race Equality Network, now working in partnership with the work that Anna and David are doing on rebuilding and reconceiving what public mental health should look like. I think there is a real opportunity to try and make change happen. But let's approach it with that video of Tim Kendall and Colin and their interaction in mind. This isn't going to be an easy path. Of course, we've all got bored to death with hearing how long these problems have been well recognized, but despite many attempts to change them, they haven't changed. But of course, if we don't make the attempt, they clearly won't change. So maybe between us, we've got something new to bring to this challenge now, and we can make real change happen. So thank you to all our panelists and chairs for a very stimulating drive in that direction. We look forward to this work being taken further. And Anna and David, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn if I say I believe you're establishing a network within the centre to carry forward the work on public mental health generally. And one of the ways in which the centre has worked as a genuinely collaborating centre is to bring together collaborations between networks of people. It's a very powerful way of moving things forward, even in such an intransigent area as race equality and mental health. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all